his reciting mouth filling with water. He popped back up, crying, "Help me, Gordy! Help me!" Then he was dragged under again. Looking into the clear water, I could see two bloated, naked corpses holding his ankles. One was Vern and the other was Teddy, and their open eyes were as blank and pupilless as the eyes of Greek statues. Their small prepubescent penises floated limply up from their distended bellies like albino strands of kelp. Chris's head broke water again. He held one hand up limply to me and voiced a screaming, womanish cry that rose and rose, ululating in the hot, sunny summer air. I looked wildly towards the beach, but nobody had heard. The lifeguard, his bronzed athletic body lolling attractively on the seat at the top of his whitewashed cruciform wooden tower, just went on smiling down at a girl in a red bathing suit. Chris's scream turned into a bubbling, water-choked gurgle as the corpses pulled him under again. And as they dragged him down to the black water, I could see his rippling, distorted eyes turned up to me in pleading agony. I could see his white starfish hands held helplessly up to the sun-burnished roof of the water. But instead of diving down and trying to save him, I stroked madly for the shore, or at least to a place where the water would not be over my head. Before I could get there, before I could even get close, I felt a soft, rotted, implacable hand wrap itself around my calf and begin to pull. A scream built up in my chest, but before I could utter it, the dream washed away into a grainy facsimile of reality. It was Teddy with his hand on my leg. He was shaking me awake. It was my watch. Still half in the dreams, almost talking in my sleep, I asked him thickly, "You alive, Teddy?" "No, I'm dead, and you're a black nigger," he said crossly. It dispelled the last of the dream. I sat up by the campfire, and Teddy lay down. Chapter 20. The others slept heavily through the rest of the night. I was in and out, dozing, waking, dozing again. The night was far from silent. I heard the triumphant screech-squawk of a pouncing owl, the tiny cry of some small animal perhaps about to be eaten, a larger something blundering wildly through the undergrowth. Under all of this, a steady tone, were the crickets. There were no more screams. I dozed and woke and dozed, and I suppose if I had been discovered standing such a slipshod watch in Ladeo, I probably would have been court-martialed and shot. I snapped more solidly out of my last doze and became aware that something was different. I took a moment or two to figure it out. Although the moon was down, I could see my hands resting on my jeans. My watch said 5:15. It was dawn. I stood, hearing my spine crackle, walked 24 feet away from the lumped-together bodies of my friends, and pissed into a clump of sumac. I was starting to shake the night willies. I could feel them sliding away. It was a fine feeling. I scrambled up the cinders to the railroad tracks and sat on one of the rails, idly chucking cinders between my feet, in no hurry to wake the others. At that precise moment, the new day felt too good to share. Morning came on apace. The noise of the crickets began to drop, and the shadows under the trees and bushes evaporated like puddles after a shower. The air had that peculiar lack of taste that presages the latest hot day in a famous series of hot days. Birds that had maybe cowered all night, just as we had done, now began to twitter self-importantly. A wren landed on top of the deadfall from which we had taken our firewood, preened itself, and then flew off. I don't know how long I sat there on that rail, watching the purple steal out of the sky as noiselessly as it had stolen in the evening before. Long enough for my butt to start complaining, anyway. I was about to get up when I looked to my right and saw a deer standing in the railroad bed not 10 yards from me. My heart went up into my throat so high that I think I could have put my hand in my mouth and touched it. My stomach and genitals filled with a hot, dry excitement. I didn't move. I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. Her eyes weren't brown, but a dark, dusty black, the kind of velvet you see backgrounding jewelry displays. Her small ears were scuffed suede. She looked serenely at me, head slightly lowered in what I took for curiosity. Seeing a kid with his hair in a sleek scarecrow of whorls and many-tined cowlicks, wearing jeans with cuffs and a brown khaki shirt with the elbows mended and the collar turned up in the hoodie tradition of the day. What I was seeing was some sort of gift, something given with a carelessness that was appalling. We looked at each other for a long time. I think it was a long time. Then she turned and walked off to the other side of the tracks, white bobtail flipping insouciantly. She found grass and began to crop. I couldn't believe it. She had begun to crop. She didn't look back at me, and didn't need to. I was frozen solid. Then the rail started to thrum under my ass, and bare seconds later the doe's head came up, cocked back towards Castle Rock. She stood there, her branch-black nose working on the air, coaxing it a little. Then she was gone in 3 gangling leaps, vanishing into the woods with no sound but one rotted branch, which broke with a sound like a track ref's starter gun. I sat there, looking mesmerized at the spot where she had been, until the actual sound of the freight came up through the stillness. Then I skidded back down the bank to where the others were sleeping. The freight's slow, loud passage woke them up, yawning and scratching. There was some funny, nervous talk about the case of the screaming ghost, as Chris called it, but not as much as you might imagine. In daylight it seemed more foolish than interesting, almost embarrassing, best forgotten. It was on the tip of my tongue to tell them about the deer, but I ended up not doing it. That was one thing I kept to myself. I've never spoken or written of it until just now, today, and I have to tell you that it seems a lesser thing written down, damn near inconsequential. But for me it was the best part of that trip, the cleanest part, and it was a moment I found myself returning to almost helplessly when there was trouble in my life. My first day in the bush in Vietnam, and this fellow walked into the clearing where we were with his hand over his nose, and when we took his hand away, there was no nose there, because it had been shot off. The time the doctor told us our youngest son might be hydrocephalic. He turned out just to have an oversized head, thank God. The long, crazy weeks before my mother died. I would find my thoughts turning back to that morning, the scuffed suede of her ears, the white flash of her tail. But 500 million red Chinese don't give a shit, right? The most important things are the hardest to say, because words diminish them. It's hard to make strangers care about the good things in your life. Chapter 21. The tracks now bent southwest and ran through tangles of second-growth fir and heavy underbrush. We got a breakfast of late blackberries from some of these bushes, but berries never fill you up. Your stomach just gives them a 30-minute option and then begins growling again. We went back to the tracks. It was about 8 o'clock by then, and took 5. Our mouths were a dark purple, and our naked torsos were scratched from the blackberry brambles. Vern wished glumly aloud for a couple of fried eggs with bacon on the side. That was the last day of the heat, and I think it was the worst of all. The early scud of clouds melted away, and by 9 o'clock the sky was a pale steel color that made you feel hotter just looking at it. The sweat rolled and ran from our chests and backs, leaving clean streaks through the accumulated soot and grime. Mosquitoes and black flies whirled and dipped around our heads in aggravating clouds. Knowing that we had 8, maybe 10 miles to go didn't make us feel any better. Yet the fascination of the thing drew us on and kept us walking faster than we had any business doing in that heat. We were all crazy to see that kid's body. I can't put it any more simply or honestly than that. Whether it was harmless or whether it turned out to have the power to murder sleep with 100 mangled dreams, we wanted to see it. I think that we had come to believe we deserved to see it. It was about 9:30 when Teddy and Chris spotted water up ahead. They shouted to Vern and me. We ran over to where they were standing. Chris was laughing, delighted. "Look there! Beavers did that!" He pointed. It was the work of beavers, all right. A large-bore culvert ran under the railroad embankment a little way ahead, and the beavers had sealed the right end with one of their neat and industrious little dams. Sticks and branches cemented together with leaves, twigs, and dried mud. Beavers are busy little fuckers, all right. Behind the dam was a clear and shining pool of water, brilliantly mirroring the sunlight. Beaver houses humped up and out of the water in several places. They looked like wooden igloos. A small creek trickled into the far end of the pool, and the trees which bordered it were gnawed a clean bone white to a height of almost 3 feet in places. "Railroad'll clean this shit out pretty soon," Chris said. "Why?" Vernon asked. "They can't have a pool here," Chris said. "It'd undercut their previous railroad line. That's why they put that culvert in there to start with. They'll shoot them some beavers and scare off the rest, and then knock out their dam. Then this'll go back to being a bog, like it probably was before." "I think that eats the meat," Teddy said. Chris shrugged. "Who cares about beavers? Not the Great Western and Southern Maine, that's for sure." "You think it's deep enough to swim in?" Vern asked, looking hungrily at the water. "One way to find out," Teddy said. "Who goes first?" I asked. "Me," Chris said. He went running down the bank, kicking off his sneakers and untying his shirt from around his waist with a jerk. He pushed his pants and undershorts down with a single shove of his thumbs. He balanced, first on one leg and then on the other, to get his socks. Then he made a shallow dive. He came up, shaking his head to get his wet hair out of his eyes. "It's fucking great!" he shouted. "How deep?" Teddy called back. He had never learned to swim. Chris stood up in the water, and his shoulders broke the surface. I saw something on one of them, a blackish-grayish something. I decided it was a piece of mud and dismissed it. If I had looked more closely, I could have saved myself a lot of nightmares later on. "Come on in, you chickens!" He turned and thrashed off across the pool in a clumsy breaststroke, turned over and thrashed back. By then we were all getting undressed. Vern was in next, then me. Hitting the water was fantastic, clean and cool. I swam across to Chris, loving the silky feel of having nothing on but water. I stood up and we grinned into each other's faces. "Boss!" We said it at exactly the same instant. "Fucking jerk off," he said, splashed water in my face and swam off the other way. We goofed off in the water for almost half an hour before we realized that the pond was full of bloodsuckers. We dived, swam underwater, ducked each other. We never knew a thing. Then Vern swam into the shallower part, went under, and stood up on his hands. When his legs broke water in a shaky but triumphant V, I saw that they were covered with blackish-gray lumps, just like the ones I had seen on Chris's shoulder. They were slugs. Big ones. Chris's mouth dropped open, and I felt all the blood in my body go as cold as dry ice. Teddy screamed, his face going pale. Then all three of us were thrashing for the bank, going just as fast as we could. I knew more about freshwater slugs now than I did then, but the fact that they are mostly harmless has done nothing to allay the almost insane horror of them I've had ever since that day in the beaver pool. They carry a local anesthetic and an anticoagulant in their alien saliva, which means that the host never feels a thing when they attach themselves. If you don't happen to see them, they'll go on feeding until their swelled, loathsome bodies fall off you, sated, or until they actually burst. We pulled ourselves up on the bank, and Teddy went into a hysterical paroxysm as he looked down at himself. He was screaming as he picked the leeches off his naked body. Vern broke the water and looked at us, puzzled. "What the hell's wrong with Leeches!" Teddy screamed, pulling two of them off his trembling thighs and throwing them just as far as he could. "Dirty motherfucking bloodsuckers!" His voice broke shrilly on the last word. "Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh, God!" Vern cried. He paddled across the pool and stumbled out. I was still cold. The heat of the day had not suspended. I kept telling myself to catch hold, not to get screaming, not to be a pussy. I picked half a dozen off my arms and several more off my chest. Chris turned his back to me. "Gordy, are there any more? Take them off if there are, please, Gordy." There were more, 5 or 6, running down his back like grotesque black buttons. I pulled their soft, boneless bodies off him. I brushed even more off my legs, then got Chris to do my back. I was starting to relax a little, and that was when I looked down at myself and saw the granddaddy of them all clinging to my testicles. Its body swelled to 4 times its normal size. Its blackish-gray skin had gone a bruised purplish red. That was when I began to lose control. Not outside, at least not in any big way, but inside where it counts. I brushed its slick, glutinous body with the back of my hand. It held on. I tried to do it again and couldn't bring myself to actually touch it. I turned to Chris, tried to speak, couldn't. I pointed instead. His cheeks, already ashy, went whiter still. "I can't get it off," I said through numb lips. Can you... But he backed away, shaking his head, his mouth twisted. "I can't, Gordy," he said, unable to take his eyes away. "I'm sorry, but I can't. No. Oh, no." He turned away, bowed, with one hand pressed to his midsection like the butler in a musical comedy, and was sick in a stand of juniper bushes. "You got to hold on to yourself," I thought, looking at the leech that hung off me like a crazy beard. Its body was still visibly swelling. "You got to hold on to yourself and get him. Be tough. It's the last one. The last one." I reached down again and picked it off, and it burst between my fingers. My own blood ran across my palm and inner wrist in a warm flood. I began to cry. Still crying, I walked back to my clothes and put them on. I wanted to stop crying, but I just didn't seem able to turn off the waterworks. Then the shakes set in, making it worse. Vern ran up to me, still naked. "They off, Gordy? They off me? They off me?" He twirled in front of me like an insane dancer on a carnival stage. "They off? Huh? They off me, Gordy?" His eyes kept going past me, as wide and white as the eyes of a plaster horse on a merry-go-round. I nodded that they were and just kept on crying. It seemed that crying was going to be my new career. I tucked my shirt in and then buttoned it all the way to the neck. I put on my socks and my sneakers. Little by little, the tears began to slow down. Finally, there was nothing left but a few hitches and moans, and then they stopped too. Chris walked over to me, wiping his mouth with a handful of elm leaves. His eyes were wide and mute and apologetic. When we were all dressed, we just stood there looking at each other for a moment, and then we began to climb the railroad embankment. I looked back once at the burst leech lying on top of the trampled-down bushes where we had danced and screamed and groaned them off. It looked deflated, but still ominous. 14 years later, I sold my first novel and made my first trip to New York. "It's going to be a 3-day celebration," my new editor told me over the phone. "People slinging bullshit will be summarily shot." But of course it was 3 days of unmitigated bullshit. I went away thinking the publishing house believed me to be the reincarnation of Thomas Wolfe. They saw me off with perhaps other things in mind. Paperback sales in the millions, for instance. While I was there, I wanted to do all the standard out-of-towner things. See a stage show at Radio City Music Hall. Go to the top of the Empire State Building. Fuck the World Trade Center. The building King Kong climbed in 1933 is always going to be the tallest one in the world for me. Visit Times Square by night. Keith, my editor, seemed more than pleased to show his city off. The last touristy thing we did was to take a ride on the Staten Island ferry, and while leaning on the rail, I happened to look down and see scores of used condoms floating on the mild swells, and I had a moment of almost total recall. Or perhaps it was an actual incidence of time travel. Either way, for 1 second I was literally in the past, pausing halfway up that embankment and looking back at the burst leech, dead, deflated, but still ominous. Keith must have seen something in my face, because he said, "Not very pretty, are they?" I only shook my head, wanting to tell him not to apologize, wanting to tell him that you didn't have to come to the Apple and ride the ferry to see used rubbers, wanting to say, the only reason anyone writes stories is so they can understand the past and get ready for some future mortality. That's why all the verbs in stories have ed endings. Keith, my good man, even the ones that sell millions of paperbacks, the only two useful art forms are religion and stories. I was pretty drunk that night, as you may have guessed. What I did tell him was, "I was thinking of something else, that's all." The most important things are the hardest things to say. Chapter 22. We walked further down the tracks. I don't know just how far, and I was starting to think, well, okay, I'm going to be able to handle it. It's all over anyway. Just a bunch of leeches, what the fuck? I was still thinking it when waves of whiteness suddenly began to come over my sight, and I fell down. I must have fallen hard, but landing on the cross ties was like plunging into a warm and puffy, feathery bed. Someone turned me over. The touch of hands was faint and unimportant. Their faces were disembodied balloons looking down at me from miles up. They looked the way the ref's face must look to a fighter who has been punched silly and is currently taking a 10-second rest on the canvas. Their words came in gentle oscillations, fading in and out. "Him? Be all... If you think the sun... Gordy, are you..." Then I must have said something that didn't make much sense, because they began to look really worried. "We better take him back, man," Teddy said, and then the whiteness came over everything again. When it cleared, I seemed to be all right. Chris was squatting next to me, saying, "Can you hear me, Gordy? You there, man?" "Yes," I said, and sat up. A swarm of black dots exploded in front of my eyes and then went away. I waited to see if they'd come back, and when they didn't, I stood up. "You scared the cheesy old shit out of me, Gordy," he said. "You want a drink of water?" "Yeah." He gave me his canteen, half full of water, and I let 3 warm gulps roll down my throat. "Why'd you faint, Gordy?" Vern asked anxiously. "Made a bad mistake and looked at your face," I said. Teddy cackled. "Fucking Gordy, you wet." "You really okay?" Vern persisted. "Yeah, sure. It was bad there for a minute, thinking about those suckers." They nodded soberly. We took 5 in the shade and then went on walking, me and Vern on one side of the tracks again, Chris and Teddy on the other. We figured we must be getting close. Chapter 23. We weren't as close as we thought, and if we'd had the brains to spend 2 minutes looking at a road map, we would have seen why. We knew that Ray Brower's corpse had to be near the back Harlow Road, which dead-ends on the bank of the Royal River. Another trestle carries the GS and WM tracks across the Royal. So this is the way we figured. Once we got close to the Royal, we'd be getting close to the back Harlow Road, where Billy and Charlie had been parked when they saw the boy. And since the Royal was only 10 miles from the Castle River, we figured we had it made in the shade. But that was 10 miles as the crow flies, and the tracks didn't move on a straight line between the castle and the Royal. Instead, they made a very shallow loop to avoid a hilly, crumbling region called the Bluffs. Anyway, we could have seen that loop quite clearly if we had looked on a map and figured out that instead of 10 miles, we had about 16 to walk. Chris began to suspect the truth when noon had come and gone, and the Royal still wasn't in sight. We stopped while he climbed a high pine tree and took a look around. He came down and gave us a simple enough report. It was going to be at least 4 in the afternoon before we got to the Royal, and we would only make it by then if we humped right along. "Ah, shit!" Teddy cried. "So what are we going to do now?" We looked into each other's tired, sweaty faces. We were hungry and out of temper. The big adventure had turned into a long slog, dirty and sometimes scary. We would have been missed back home by now, too, and if Milo Pressman hadn't already called the cops on us, the engineer of the train crossing the trestle might have done it. We had been planning to hitchhike back to Castle Rock, but 4 o'clock was just 3 hours from dark, and nobody gives 4 kids on a backcountry road a lift after dark. I tried to summon up the cool image of my deer cropping at green morning grass, but even that seemed dusty and no good, no better than a stuffed trophy over the mantel in some guy's hunting lodge. The eyes sprayed to give them that phony, lifelike shine. Finally, Chris said, "It's still closer going ahead. Let's go." He turned and started to walk along the tracks in his dusty sneakers, head down, his shadow only a puddle at his feet. After a minute or so, the rest of us followed him, strung out in Indian file. Chapter 24. In the years between then and the writing of this memoir, I've thought remarkably little about those 2 days in September, at least consciously. The associations the memories bring to the surface are as unpleasant as week-old river corpses brought to the surface by cannon fire. As a result, I never really questioned our decision to walk down the tracks. Put another way, I've wondered sometimes about what we had decided to do, but never about how we did it. But now a much simpler scenario comes to mind. I'm confident that if the idea had come up, it would have been shot down. Walking down the tracks would have seemed neater, bosser, as we said then. But if the idea had come up and hadn't been shot down in flames, none of the things which occurred later would have happened. Maybe Chris and Teddy and Vern would even be alive today. No, they didn't die in the woods or on the railroad tracks. Nobody dies in this story except some bloodsuckers and Ray Brower, and if you want to be completely fair about it, he was dead before it even started. But it is true that of the four of us who flipped coins to see who would go down to the Florida market to get supplies, only the one who actually went is still alive. The Ancient Mariner at 34, with you, gentle reader, in the role of wedding guest. At this point, shouldn't you flip to the jacket photo to see if my eye holdeth you in its spell? If you sense a certain flipness on my part, you're right, but maybe I have cause. At an age when all four of us would be considered too young and immature to be president, 3 of us are dead. And if small events really do echo up larger and larger through time, yes, maybe if we had done the simple thing and simply hitched into Harlow, they would still be alive today. We could have hooked a ride all the way up Route 7 to the Shiloh Church, which stood at the intersection of the highway and the back Harlow Road, at least until 1967, when it was leveled by a fire attributed to a tramp's smoldering cigarette butt. With reasonable luck, we could have been beating the bushes in the area where Billy and Charlie parked their skag girlfriends before sundown of the previous day. But the idea wouldn't have lived. It wouldn't have been shot down with tightly buttressed arguments and debating society rhetoric, but with grunts and scowls and farts and raised middle fingers. The verbal part of the discussion would have been carried forward with such trenchant and sparkling contributions as, "Fuck no, that sucks," and that old reliable standby, "Did your mother ever have any kids that lived?" Unspoken, maybe it was too fundamental to be spoken, was the idea that this was a big thing. It wasn't screwing around with firecrackers or trying to look through the knothole in the back of the girls' privy at Harrison State Park. This was something on a par with getting laid for the first time, or going into the Army, or buying your first bottle of legal liquor. Just bopping into that state store, if you can dig it, selecting a bottle of good scotch, showing the clerk your draft card and driver's license, then walking out with a grin on your face and that brown bag in your hand, member of a club with just a few more rights and privileges than our old treehouse with the tin roof. There's a high ritual to all fundamental events, the rites of passage, the magic corridor where the change happens, buying the condoms, standing before the minister, raising your hand and taking the oath, or, if you please, walking down the railroad tracks to meet a fellow your own age halfway, the same as I'd walk halfway up Grand Street to meet Chris if he was coming over to my house, or the way Teddy would walk halfway down Gate Street to meet me if I was going to his. It seemed right to do it this way, because the rite of passage is a magic corridor, and so we always provide an aisle. It's what you walk down when you get married, what they carry you down when you get buried. Our corridor was those twin rails, and we walked between them, just bopping along towards whatever this was supposed to mean. You don't hitchhike your way to a thing like that, maybe. And maybe we thought it was also right that it should have turned out to be harder than we expected. Events surrounding our hike had turned into what we had suspected it was all along, serious business. What we didn't know, as we walked around the bluffs, was that Billy Tessio, Charlie Hogan, Jack Mudgett, Norman Fuzzy Brackowitz, Vince Desjardins, Chris's older brother Eyeball, and Ace Merrill himself were all on their way to take a look at the body themselves. In a weird kind of way, Ray Brower had become famous, and our secret had turned into a regular road show. They were piling into Ace's chopped and channeled 52 Ford and Vince's pink 54 Studebaker even as we started out on the last leg of our trip. Billy and Charlie had managed to keep their enormous secret for just about 24 hours. Then Charlie spilled it to Ace while they were shooting pool, and Billy had spilled it to Jack Mudgett while they were fishing for steelies from the Boom Road Bridge. Both Ace and Jack had sworn solemnly on their mothers' names to keep the secret, and that was how everybody in their gang knew about it by noon. Guess you could tell what those assholes thought about their mothers. They all congregated down at the pool hall, and Fuzzy Brackowitz advanced a theory, which you've heard before, gentle reader, that they could all become heroes, not to mention instant radio and TV personalities, by discovering the body. All they had to do, Fuzzy maintained, was to take 2 cars with a lot of fishing gear in the trunks. After they found the body, their story would be 100%. "We was just planning to take a few pickerel out of the Royal River, officer. Look what we found." They were burning up the road from Castle Rock to the back Harlow area just as we started to finally get close. Chapter 25. Clouds began to build in the sky around 2 o'clock, but at first none of us took them seriously. It hadn't rained since the early days of July, so why should it rain now? But they kept building to the south of us, up and up and up, thunderheads in great pillars as purple as bruises, and they began to move slowly our way. I looked at them closely, checking for that membrane beneath that means it's already raining 20 miles away, or 50. But there was no rain yet. The clouds were still just building. Vern got a blister on his heel, and we stopped and rested while he packed the back of his left sneaker with moss stripped from the bark of an old oak tree. "Is it going to rain, Gordy?" Teddy asked. "I think so." "Pisser," he said, and sighed. "The pisser good end to a pisser good day." I laughed, and he tipped me a wink. We started to walk again, a little more slowly now, out of respect for Vern's hurt foot. And in the hour between 2 and 3, the quality of the day's light began to change, and we knew for sure that rain was coming. It was just as hot as ever, and even more humid, but we knew. And the birds did. They seemed to appear from nowhere and swoop across the sky, chattering and crying shrilly to each other. And the light. From a steady, beating brightness, it seemed to evolve into something filtered, almost pearly. Our shadows, which had begun to grow long again, also grew fuzzy and ill-defined. The sun had begun to sail in and out through the thickening decks of clouds, and the southern sky had gone a copper shade. We watched the thunderheads lumber closer, fascinated by their size and their mute threat. Every now and then it seemed that a giant flashball had gone off inside one of them, turning their purplish, bruised color momentarily to a light gray. I saw a jagged fork of lightning lick down from the underside of the closest. It was bright enough to print a blue tattoo on my retinas. It was followed by a long, shaking blast of thunder. We did a little bitching about how we were going to get caught out in the rain, but only because it was the expected thing. Of course, we were all looking forward to it. It would be cold and refreshing, and leech-free. At a little past 3:30, we saw running water through a break in the trees. "That's it!" Chris yelled jubilantly. "That's the Royal!" We began to walk faster, taking our second wind. The storm was getting close now. The air began to stir, and it seemed that the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a space of seconds. I looked down and saw that my shadow had disappeared entirely. We were walking in pairs again, each two watching a side of the railroad embankment. My mouth was dry, throbbing with a sickish tension. The sun sailed behind another cloud bank, and this time it didn't come back out. For a moment the bank's edges were embroidered with gold, like a cloud in an Old Testament Bible illustration, and then the wine-colored, dragging belly of the thunderhead blotted out all traces of the sun. The day became gloomy. The clouds were rapidly eating up the last of the blue. We could smell the river so clearly that we might have been horses, or perhaps it was the smell of rain impending in the air as well. There was an ocean above us, held in by a thin sack that might rupture and let down a flood at any second. I kept trying to look into the underbrush, but my eyes were continually drawn back to that turbulent, racing sky. In its deepening colors you could read whatever doom you liked: water, fire, wind, hail. The cool breeze became more insistent, hissing in the firs. A sudden, impossible bolt of lightning flashed down, seemingly from directly overhead, making me cry out and clap my hands to my eyes. God had taken my picture. A little kid with his shirt tied around his waist, duck bumps on his bare chest and cinders on his cheeks. I heard the rending fall of some big tree not 60 yards away. The crack of thunder which followed made me cringe. I wanted to be at home reading a good book in a safe place, like down in the potato cellar. "Jesus!" Vern screamed in a high, fainting voice. "Oh, my Jesus Christ! Look at that!" I looked in the direction Vern was pointing and saw a blue-white fireball bowling its way up the left-hand rail of the GS and WM tracks, cracking and hissing for all the world like a scalded cat. It hurried past us as we turned to watch it go, dumbfounded, aware for the first time that such things could exist. 20 feet beyond us, it made a sudden pop and just disappeared, leaving a greasy smell of ozone behind.
"What am I doing here, anyway?" Teddy muttered. "What a pisser!" Chris exclaimed happily, his face upturned. "This is going to be a pisser like you wouldn't believe." But I was with Teddy. Looking up at that sky gave me a dismaying sense of vertigo. It was more like looking into some deeply mysterious marbled gorge. Another lightning bolt crashed down, making us duck. This time the ozone smell was hotter, more urgent. The following clap of thunder came with no perceptible pause at all. My ears were still ringing from it when Vern began to screech triumphantly, "There! There he is! Right there! I see him!" I can see Vern right this minute, if I want to. All I have to do is sit back for a minute and close my eyes. He's standing there on the left-hand rail like an explorer on the prow of his ship, one hand shielding his eyes from the silver stroke of lightning that has just come down, the other extended and pointing. We ran up beside him and looked. I was thinking to myself, Vern's imagination just ran away with him, that's all. The suckers, the heat, now this storm. His eyes are dealing wild cards, that's all. But that wasn't what it was, although there was a split second when I wanted it to be. In that split second I knew I never wanted to see a corpse, not even a run-over woodchuck. In the place where we were standing, early spring rains had washed part of the embankment away, leaving a gravelly, uncertain 4-foot drop-off. The railroad maintenance crews had either not yet gotten around to it in their yellow diesel-operated repair carts, or it had happened so recently it hadn't yet been reported. At the bottom of this washout was a marshy, mucky tangle of undergrowth that smelt bad, and sticking out of a wild clock spring of blackberry brambles was a single pale white hand. Did any of us breathe? I didn't. The breeze was now a wind, harsh and jerky, coming at us from no particular direction, jumping and whirling, slapping at our sweaty skins and open pores. I hardly noticed. I think part of my mind was waiting for Teddy to cry out, "Paratroops over the side," and I thought if he did that I might just go crazy. It would have been better to see the whole body, all at once, but instead there was only that limp, outstretched hand, horribly white, the fingers limply splayed like the hands of a drowned boy. It told us the truth of the whole matter. It explained every graveyard in the world. The image of that hand came back to me every time I heard or read of an atrocity. Somewhere, attached to that hand, was the rest of Ray Brower. Lightning flickered and stroked. Thunder ripped in behind each stroke as if a drag race had started over our heads. "Shit," Chris said. The sound, not quite a cuss word, not quite the country version of shit as it is pronounced around a slender stem of timothy grass when the baler breaks down. Instead, it was a long, tuneless syllable without meaning, a sigh that had just happened to pass through the vocal cords. Vern was licking his lips in a compulsive sort of way, as if he had tasted some obscure new delicacy, a Howard Johnson's 29th flavor. Tibetan sausage rolls, interstellar escargot, something so weird that it excited and revolted him at the same time. Teddy only stood and looked. The wind whipped his greasy, clotted hair first away from his ears and then back over them. His face was a total blank. I could tell you I saw something there, and perhaps I did, in hindsight, but not then. There were black ants trundling back and forth across the hand. A great whispering noise began to rise in the woods on either side of the tracks, as if the forest had just noticed we were there and was commenting on it. The rain had started. Dime-sized drops fell on my head and arms. They struck the embankment, turning the fill dark for a moment, and then the color changed back again as the greedy dry ground sucked the moisture up. Those big drops fell for maybe 5 seconds, and then they stopped. I looked at Chris, and he blinked back at me.
Then the storm came all at once, as if a shower chain had been pulled in the sky. The whispering sound changed to loud contention. It was as if we were being rebuked for our discovery, and it was frightening. Nobody tells you about the pathetic fallacy until you're in college, and even then I noticed that nobody but the total dorks completely believed it was a fallacy. Chris jumped over the side of the washout, his hair already soaked and clinging to his head. I followed. Vern and Teddy came close behind, but Chris and I were first to reach the body of Ray Brower. He was face down. Chris looked into my eyes, his face set and stern, an adult's face. I nodded slightly, as if he had spoken aloud. I think he was down here and relatively intact instead of up there between the rails and completely mangled because he was trying to get out of the way when the train hit him, knocking him head over heels. He had landed with his head pointed towards the tracks, arms over his head like a diver about to execute. He had landed in this boggy cup of land that was becoming a small swamp. His hair was a dark reddish color. The moisture in the air had made it curl slightly at the ends. There was blood in it, but not a great deal, not a gross-out amount. The ants were grosser. He was wearing a solid-colored dark green T-shirt and blue jeans. His feet were bare, and a few feet behind him, caught in tall blackberry brambles, I saw a pair of filthy, low-topped Keds. For a moment I was puzzled. Why was he here and his tennies there? Then I realized, and the realization was like a dirty punch below the belt. My wife, my kids, my friends, they all think that having an imagination like mine must be quite nice. Aside from making all this dough, I can have a little mind movie whenever things get dull. Mostly they're right. But every now and then it turns around and bites the shit out of you with these long teeth, teeth that have been filed to points like the teeth of a cannibal. You see things you just as soon not see, things that keep you awake until first light. I saw one of those things now, saw it with absolute clarity and certainty. He had been knocked spang out of his Keds. The train had knocked him out of his Keds, just as it had knocked the life out of his body. That finally rammed it all the way home for me. The kid was dead. The kid wasn't sick. The kid wasn't sleeping. The kid wasn't going to get up in the morning anymore, or get the runs from eating too many apples, or catch poison ivy, or wear out the eraser on the end of his Ticonderoga No. 2 during a hard math test. The kid was dead, stone dead. The kid was never going to go out bottling with his friends in the spring, gunny sack over his shoulder, to pick up the returnables the retreating snow uncovered. The kid wasn't going to wake up at 2:00 a.m. on the morning of the 1st of November this year, run to the bathroom and vomit up a big glurt of cheap Halloween candy. The kid wasn't going to pull a single girl's braid in homeroom. The kid wasn't going to give a bloody nose, or get one. The kid was can't, don't, won't, never, shouldn't, wouldn't, couldn't. He was the side of the battery where the terminal says neg, the fuse you have to put a penny in, the wastebasket by the teacher's desk, which always smells of wood shavings from the sharpener and dead orange peels from lunch, the haunted house outside of town where the windows are crashed out, the no trespassing signs whipped away across the fields, the attic full of bats, the cellar full of worms. The kid was dead, mister, ma'am, young sir, little miss. I could go on all day and never get it right about the distance between his bare feet on the ground and his dirty Keds hanging in the bushes. It was 30+ inches. It was a googol of light years. The kid was disconnected from his Keds beyond all hope of reconciliation. He was dead. We turned him face up into the pouring rain, the lightning, the steady crack of thunder. There were ants and bugs all over his face and neck. They ran briskly in and out of the round collar of his T-shirt. His eyes were open, but terrifyingly out of sync. One was rolled back so far that we could see only a tiny arc of pupil. The other stared straight up into the storm. There was a dried froth of blood above his mouth and on his chin, from a bloody nose, I thought, and the right side of his face was lacerated and darkly bruised. Still, I thought, he didn't really look bad. I had once walked into a door my brother Dennis was shoving open, came off with bruises even worse than this kid's, plus the bloody nose, and still had 2 helpings of everything for supper after it happened. Teddy and Vern stood behind us, and if there had been any sight at all left in that one upward-staring eye, I suppose we would have looked to Ray Brower like pallbearers in a horror movie. A beetle came out of his mouth, trekked across his fuzzless cheek, stepped into a nettle, and was gone.
"Did you see that?"
Teddy asked in a high, strange, fainting voice.
"I bet he's fucking full of bugs. I bet his brains are—"
"Shut up, Teddy," Chris said, and Teddy did, looking relieved. Lightning forked blue across the sky, making the boy's single eye light up. You could almost believe he was glad to be found, and found by boys his own age. His torso had swelled up, and there was a faint gassy odor about him, like the smell of old farts. I turned away, sure I was going to be sick, but my stomach was dry, hard, steady. I suddenly rammed 2 fingers down my throat, trying to make myself heave, needing to do it, as if I could sick it up and get rid of it. But my stomach only hitched a little and then was steady again. The roaring downpour and the accompanying thunder had completely covered the sound of cars approaching along the back Harlow Road, which lay bare yards beyond this boggy tangle. It likewise covered the crackle-crunch of the underbrush as they blundered through it from the dead end where they had parked. And the first we knew of them was Ace Merrill's voice, raised above the tumult of the storm, saying, "Well, what the fuck do you know about this?" Chapter 26. We all jumped like we'd been goosed, and Vern cried out. He admitted later that he thought for just a second that the voice had come from the dead boy. On the far side of the boggy patch where the woods took up again, masking the butt end of the road, Ace Merrill and Eyeball Chambers stood together, half obscured by a pouring gray curtain of rain. They were both wearing red nylon high school jackets, the kind you can buy in the office if you're a regular student, the same kind they give away free to varsity sports players. Their DA haircuts had been plastered back against their skulls, and a mixture of rainwater and Vitalis ran down their cheeks like ersatz tears. "Some bitch," Eyeball said. "That's my little brother." Chris was staring at Eyeball with his mouth open. His shirt, wet, limp, and dark, was still tied around his skinny middle. His pack, stained a darker green by the rain, was hanging against his naked shoulder blades. "You get away, Rich," he said in a trembling voice. "We found him. We got dibs." "Fuck your dibs. We're going to report him." "No, you're not," I said. I was suddenly furious with them, turning up this way at the last minute. If we'd thought about it, we'd have known something just like this was going to happen. But this was one time, somehow, that the older, bigger kids weren't going to steal it, to take something they wanted as if by divine right, as if their easy way was the right way, the only way. They had come in cars. I think that was what made me angriest. They had come in cars. "There's 4 of us, Eyeball. You just try." "Oh, we'll try. Don't worry," Eyeball said, and the trees shook behind him, and Ace, Charlie Hogan, and Vern's brother Billy stepped through them, cursing and wiping water out of their eyes. I felt a lead ball drop into my belly. It grew bigger as Jack Mudgett and Fuzzy Brackowitz stepped out behind Charlie and Billy. "Here we all are," Ace said, grinning. "So you just—" "Vern!" Billy Tessio cried in a terrible, accusing, "My justeth cometh, and that right early" voice. He made a pair of dripping fists. "You little son of a bitch! You was under the porch, cockknocker!" Vern flinched. Charlie Hogan waxed positively lyrical. "You little keyhole-peeping, cunt-licking bung-wipe! I ought to beat the living shit out of you!" "Yeah? Well, try it," Teddy brayed suddenly. His eyes were crazily alight behind his rain-spotted glasses. "Come on, fight you for him! Come on, big men!" Billy and Charlie didn't need a second invitation. They started forward together, and Vern flinched again, no doubt visualizing the ghosts of beatings past and beatings yet to come. He flinched, but hung tough. He was with his friends, and we had been through a lot, and we hadn't got here in a couple of cars. But Ace held Billy and Charlie back simply by touching each of them on the shoulder.
"Now listen, you guys,"
Ace said. He spoke patiently, just as if we weren't all standing in a roaring rainstorm.
"There's more of us than there are of you. We're bigger. We'll give you one chance to just blow away. I don't give a fuck where. Just make like a tree and leaf."
Chris's brother giggled, and Fuzzy clapped Ace on the back in appreciation of his great wit, the Sid Caesar of the J.D. set.
"'Cause we're taking him."
Ace smiled gently, and you could imagine him smiling that same gentle smile just before breaking his cue over the head of some uneducated punk who had made the terrible mistake of lipping off while Ace was lining up a shot.
"If you go, we'll take him. If you stay, we'll beat the piss out of you and still take him. Besides," he added, trying to gild the thuggery with a little righteousness, "Charlie and Billy found him, so it's their dibs anyway." "They was chicken," Teddy shot back. "Vern told us about it. They was fucking chicken right out of their fucking minds."
He screwed his face up into a terrified, sniveling parody of Charlie Hogan.
"I wish we never boosted that car. I wish we never went on no back Harlow Road to whack off a piece. Oh, Billy, what are we going to do? Oh, Billy, I think I just made a pile in my Fruit of the Looms. Oh, Billy."
"That's it," Charlie said, starting forward again. His face was knotted with rage and sullen embarrassment.
"Kid, whatever your name is, get ready to reach down your fucking throat the next time you need to pick your nose."
I looked wildly down at Ray Brower. He stared calmly up into the rain, with his one eye below us but above it all. The thunder was still booming steadily, but the rain had begun to slack off.
"What do you say, Gordy?"
Ace asked. He was holding Charlie lightly by the arm, the way an accomplished trainer would restrain a vicious dog.
"You must have at least some of your brother's sense. Tell these guys to back off. I'll let Charlie beat up the Four Eyes El Punko a little bit, and then we all go about our business. What do you say?"
He was wrong to mention Denny. I had wanted to reason with him, to point out what Ace knew perfectly well, that we had every right to take Billy and Charlie's dibs, since Vern had heard them giving said dibs away. I wanted to tell him how Vern and I had almost gotten run down by a freight train on the trestle which spans the Castle River, about Milo Pressman and his fearless, if stupid, sidekick, Chopper the Wonder Dog, about the Bloodsuckers, too. I guess all I really wanted to tell him was, "Come on, Ace, fair is fair. You know that." But he had to bring Denny into it, and what I heard coming out of my mouth, instead of sweet reason, was my own death warrant.
"Suck my fat one, you cheap dime store hood!"
Ace's mouth formed a perfect O of surprise. The expression was so unexpectedly prissy that under other circumstances it would have been a laugh riot, so to speak. All of the others, on both sides of the bog, stared at me, dumbfounded. Then Teddy screamed gleefully,
"That's telling him, Gordy! Oh, boy! Too cool!"
I stood numbly unable to believe it. It was like some crazed understudy had shot on stage at the crucial moment and declaimed lines that weren't even in the play. Telling a guy to suck was as bad as he could get without resorting to his mother. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that Chris had unshouldered his knapsack and was digging into it frantically. But I didn't get it. Not then, anyway.
"Okay," Ace said softly. "Let's take 'em. Don't hurt nobody but the LaChance kid. I'm gonna break both his fucking arms."
I went dead cold. I didn't piss myself the way I had on the railroad trestle, but it must have been because I had nothing inside to let out. He meant it, you see. The years between then and now changed my mind about a lot of things, but not about that. When Ace said he was going to break both of my arms, he absolutely meant it. They started to walk towards us through the slackening rain. Jackie Mudgett took a DeMano switch knife out of his pocket and hit the chrome. 6 inches of steel flicked out, dove-gray in the afternoon half-light. Vern and Teddy dropped suddenly into fighting crouches on either side of me. Teddy did so eagerly, Vern with a desperate, cornered grimace on his face. The big kids advanced in a line, their feet splashing through the bog, which was now one big sludgy puddle because of the storm. The body of Ray Brower lay at our feet like a waterlogged barrel. I got ready to fight, and that was when Chris fired the pistol he had hawked out of his old man's dresser. Kabam! God, what a wonderful sound that was. Charlie Hogan jumped right up into the air. Ace Merrill, who had been staring straight at me, now jerked around and looked at Chris. His mouth made that O again. Eyeball looked absolutely astounded.
"Hey, Chris, that's Daddy's," he said. "You're going to get the tar whaled out of you. That's nothing to what you'll get," Chris said. His face was horribly pale, and all the life in him seemed to have been sucked upward into his eyes. They blazed out of his face. "Gordy was right. You're nothing but a bunch of cheap hoods. Charlie and Billy didn't want their fucking dibs, and you all know it. We wouldn't have walked way the fuck out here if they said they did. They just went someplace and puked the story up and let Ace Merrill do their thinking for them."
His voice rose to a scream.
"But you ain't gonna get him! Do you hear me?"
"Now listen," Ace said. "You better put that down before you take your foot off with it."
"You ain't got the sack to shoot a woodchuck."
He began to walk forward again, smiling his gentle smile as he came.
"You're just a sawed-off, pint-sized, pissy-ass little runt, and I'm going to make you eat that fucking gun. Ace, if you don't stand still, I'm going to shoot you. I swear to God." "You'll go to jail,"
Ace crooned, not even hesitating. He was still smiling. The others watched him with horrified fascination, much the same way as Teddy and Vern and I were looking at Chris. Ace Merrill was the hardest case for miles around, and I didn't think Chris could bluff him down. And what did that leave? Ace didn't think a 12-year-old punk would actually shoot him. I thought he was wrong. I thought Chris would shoot Ace before he let Ace take his father's pistol away from him. In those few seconds I was sure there was going to be bad trouble, the worst I'd ever known. Killing trouble, maybe. And all of it over who got dibs on a dead body. Chris said softly, with great regret,
"Where do you want it, Ace? Arm or leg? I can't pick. You pick for me."
And Ace stopped. Chapter 27. His face sagged, and I saw sudden terror on it. It was Chris's tone rather than his actual words, I think. The real regret that things were going to go from bad to worse. If it was a bluff, it's still the best I've ever seen. The other big kids were totally convinced. Their faces were squinched up as if someone had just touched a match to a cherry bomb with a short fuse. Ace slowly got control of himself. The muscles in his face tightened again, his lips pressed together, and he looked at Chris the way you'd look at a man who had made a serious business proposition, to merge with your company, or handle your line of credit, or shoot your balls off. It was a waiting, almost curious expression, one that made you know that the terror was either gone or tightly lidded. Ace had recomputed the odds on not getting shot and had decided that they weren't as much in his favor as he had thought. But he was still dangerous, maybe more than before. Since then, I've thought it was the rawest piece of brinkmanship I've ever seen. Neither of them was bluffing. They both meant business.
"All right," Ace said softly, speaking to Chris. "But I know how you're going to come out of this, motherfuck." "No, you don't," Chris said. "You little prick," Eyeball said loudly. "You're going to wind up in traction for this." "Bite my bag," Chris told him. With an inarticulate sound of rage, Eyeball started forward, and Chris put a bullet into the water about 10 feet in front of him. It kicked up a splash. Eyeball jumped back, cursing. "Okay, now what?" Ace asked. "Now you guys get into your cars and bomb on back to Castle Rock. After that, I don't care. But you ain't getting him." He touched Ray Brower lightly, almost reverently, with the toe of one sopping sneaker. "You dig me?" "But we'll get you," Ace said. He was starting to smile again. "Don't you know that?" "We'll get you hard," Ace said, smiling. "We'll hurt you. I can't believe you don't know that. We'll put you all in the fucking hospital with fucking ruptures. Sincerely." "Oh? Why don't you go home and fuck your mother some more? I hear she loves the way you do it."
Ace's smile froze.
I'll kill you for that. Nobody ranks my mother. I heard your mother fucks for bucks, Chris informed him.
And as Ace began to pale, as his complexion began to approach Chris's own ghastly whiteness, he added,
In fact, I heard she throws blowjobs for jukebox nickels. I heard—
Then the storm came back, viciously, all at once.